We're now standing at the Madison family cemetery, and this is where members of the Madison family have been buried since James Madison's grandfather first settled this land in the 1720s. In fact, it was Madison's grandfather, Ambrose Madison, who was the first individual to be buried here. In the 1720s, he patented this land. He sent a crew of slaves out to comply with the legal requirements, which were that he seat and plant the property. Seat means build a residence. Plant means start farming. He followed in 1732 with his family. Within 6 months, he was dead. Interestingly enough, it has been only in the past 10 years that we have discovered ancient court records that indicate that 3 slaves were tried and convicted for murdering Ambrose Madison. We know that one of them was executed, according to the court records, and 2 were punished and then returned to their owners. Now, it's interesting how we look at this evidence and how we interpret it, because all it tells us is that 3 slaves were tried and convicted. We don't really know who did it. We know the court system found them guilty. It does tell us, though, that even an enslaved African American on a plantation was regarded as an individual who was legally responsible for their actions and could be held accountable. Now again, we need to look at this record and realize there are many different interpretations and meanings that could be read into it. There are over 100 members of the Madison family buried here, but you would never know that by looking at it, because in fact there are only about 40 tombstones in this cemetery. We know from these records, in fact, that Madison's grandparents, Ambrose and his wife, are buried in unmarked graves. We know that Madison's parents are buried in unmarked graves. In fact, the marker on James Madison's grave was not put in place until some 20 years after he passed away. This pathway leads to the slave cemetery here at Montpelier, and it really communicates a very important aspect of the Montpelier plantation, which is that there were many, many African Americans living here, many more than members of the Madison family, and that this was their home as well. They formed a community, they had relations with each other, with slaves in neighboring plantations, and so this was a thriving, self-sufficient community, plantation community. They too needed a burial spot. It is markedly different from the Madison family burial. It's not enclosed by a brick wall. It's here in an area where trees have subsequently grown up, so it has received less attention by subsequent owners. Let's go back and take a look. There are no markers of the grave sites here, and what gave the evidence that presented itself is that as the coffins rotted and collapsed, the ground above them settled, so that a careful mapping of this area, a 3-dimensional mapping, and you can actually see that in this computer schematic here, reveals that the ground here is actually pockmarked with the remains of each of those graves. There are about 40 of them here. We think there are many other graves here as well. They likely were filled in when the slave community was still actively taking care of the cemetery prior to emancipation at the end of the Civil War. An oral tradition that descendants of Montpelier slaves have told us is that the periwinkle you see here was planted intentionally to help mark this area because it blooms in the springtime. And so it linked into ideas of rebirth and resurrection that are part of the Christian religion that had become part of their lives.